Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of two videos on human population, planetary resources, and conservation. In this first video, we're going to talk about some of the concepts of human population dynamics, as well as some of our natural resources here on Earth. Um, this is the last chapter in our textbook, and so we are rapidly approaching the end of the semester. But hopefully, you've been watching these videos and learning a little something along the way. In any event, let's get started. Human population is on Earth is currently 7 billion, approximately. All right. Now, all the statistics in this video are a couple of years old, and so it's a little bit higher now than it was when I first put together this PowerPoint. But we add approximately 78 million people each year to the human population. Um, as you can well imagine, the growth rate of human population is determined by two factors. All right, the number of births that occur each year and the number of deaths that occur each year. All right, if the number of births in a given area outweighs the number of deaths, then the population grows. If the number of births is less than the number of deaths, then obviously the population decreases. But overall, the human population on Earth is growing at an exponential rate. In other words, a curve, a very drastic, steep curve. Now, why is this a concern for biologists and specifically ecologists? Well, the answer is that there is something that we call the biotic potential. And this is what we call the maximum growth rate under ideal conditions. And typically, this is limited by the environment. Now, in a natural population of deer or raccoons or wolves, this potential is defined by the number, the amount of food that's available, the amount of living space that's available, and potentially the number of predators that is around to cull the population. Um, and most natural populations will reach what we call a carrying capacity. This is the level of population that can be sustained by the environment forever. Um, and it's not an infinite thing. It's not a something that is or can be exponential. And so the population of any species needs to reach a leveling off point at somewhere that the Earth can actually sustain, or the at least that ecosystem can sustain a population of that size. Now, some people have argued that the Earth has already passed its carrying capacity for humans, that there are way too many people on the planet for us to sustain life on Earth, at least human life on Earth, for much longer. Others suggest that the world can actually hold 50 to 100 billion people, but I can't even imagine just how crowded that would be. All right, that's more than 10 times the amount of folks living on the Earth at this point. Now, interestingly enough, human population growth really falls into two major categories. Um, and it depends on what country you are talking about. In more developed countries like the United States, many of the European countries, and some others, um, the population growth has stabilized considerably. And you can see that in the pink lines that are shown here all the way across. All right. And so this is about where we are today. And if the trends continue, the range of possibilities is somewhere here, a little bit less than 2 billion people. Whoops. On the other hand, if you look at the less developed countries, and this includes a lot of countries in Africa, South America, Southern Asia, these guys have, again, right about here is where we are now, All right, the potential is to grow this way, or maybe to level off that growth um, here. And so this is the potential range for the less developed countries. This is the potential range for the more developed countries by 2250. All right, so that's, we're talking more than 200 years in the future at this point. Now, at the current growth rates, we're going to approach somewhere near 12 billion people, all right, which is an awful lot of people. Okay, so what's the difference between the more developed countries and the less developed countries? Well, in more developed countries, we tend to have a lower population increase. Now, the population is still getting larger, but the increase averages at around 0.1% per year. All right. Just as a reference point, the United States is growing at about 0.6% per year. Um, the less developed countries, on the other hand, are growing at a rate of 1.6% each year. And some countries, most of them found in Africa, are increasing at a much higher rate. Right now, in the world, the average number of births per 1,000 people is 18.7. So annually, what this means is that every 1,000 people produces 18.7 babies. Um, and the death rate is 7.9 individuals per 1,000. All right. And so that is an exponential growth rate of 1.08%. So, in other words, the human population on Earth is increasing by over 1% every year. Now, that may not seem like much, but remember that 1% of 7 billion is 70 million. Right. And so that's a lot of people. Now, even though the world's growth rate has slowed down over the course of the last century or so, the population is going to continue to increase because more women enter their reproductive years every year than leave their reproductive years every year. And so more babies are, well, potentially more babies will be born each year than people will die each year. Okay. Um, Now, the more developed countries once had very high population increases because of modern medicine. Right, the medical advances that we've had over the last 100 years allowed the United States population to increase considerably. The death rate declined, um, and then following that, the birth rate declined. In the less developed countries, the death rate has declined also due to modern medicine, but the birth rate has not declined. And that's why the less developed countries have a much greater growth rate than the more developed countries. This is a fascinating graph showing the age structure in more developed countries and less developed countries. On the top, you see more developed countries, like the United States, for example. And you can see most of the people in the more developed countries are in the reproductive years, or a very large number of them in terms of millions. All right, there's also a lot of kids, which are the pre-reproductive folks, and then there's a lot and lot of old folks, especially in the United States and Europe. Okay, if you compare that to some of the less developed countries, you can see gazillions of kids here. All right, a bunch of folks in their reproductive age, and then not so many. All right, why is this? The medical care is not as great. Death rates are higher. People don't live as long. All right, so um, you got to consider this when you're talking about human population, because it does vary considerably between less and more developed countries. Let's move on now to some of the resources that all of these people have to have access to in order to survive. All right. The planetary resources on Earth currently fall into two different categories. We have the non renewable resources, which are limited in supply. In other words, we can, use them up or run out of them. And this includes the amount of land, arable land for farming and that sort of thing, but also resources that were produced millions of years ago, like fossil fuels, and even billions of years ago, like some of the minerals. All right, we're burning our fossil fuels at a very high rate, and sooner or later we will run out of them. So we need to develop other resources, energy resources, to replace them. Minerals are non-replaceable at all. Gold, silver, copper, iron, all of those minerals that we mine from the ground are things that cannot be replaced. They can be recycled for sure, but they can't be replaced. Now, on the other hand, renewable resources are things that are able to be replenished naturally. All right, this includes things like water, plants, and animals for food, and solar energy. Now, the difficulty, well, we'll talk about energy a little bit later on. Um, Pollution is a side effect of resource consumption. All right, when you mine minerals out of the ground, when you farm, when you interfere with the water cycle and that kind of thing, you use up the resources and you pollute the environment. And as the population of humans increases, the amount of pollution generally increases as well. All right, in more developed countries, we've got lots of rules and regulations that are designed to protect the environment, but it's not always uh, possible to eliminate pollution altogether. Um, one of the big issues over the last 3 years was the fact that the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. Um, we promised during those accords. I think it was the Obama administration that signed it. That we promised not to put X amount of carbon into the atmosphere and da 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 da. Da. And it's a fine, good idea to try to limit that. But the difficulty is that countries classified as less developed countries are can dump as much carbon as they want into the atmosphere, and so it doesn't really matter. The amount of carbon is going to increase regardless of what the folks in the United States do. And so, while there are merits to doing things like that, it's got to be an across the board thing as opposed to just really putting it on the more developed countries. Land, it comes in a couple of different uh, types, but some of the things that I want to point out to you are beaches, semi-arid lands, and tropical rainforests. Now, beaches are a fascinating thing. It turns out that 40% of the world's population, now think about that, lives within 60 miles of a coastline, all right, the edge of a continent somewhere. All right, 40% of the population. All right, that means that the other 60% is spread out over the inland areas. That means that there's not many people living in the middle of the United States compared to the folks living on the coast. Now, we are in New York State right now, and obviously, New York is a very populated state. It's one of the largest states in the United States. And in the United States, it turns out that more than 50% of the people live within 50 miles of a beach. All right, that's a lot of folks. What this leads to is beach erosion and habitat loss. And the loss of the wetlands can be a huge problem because it tends to be a buffer for storms like hurricanes. And it also is a very diverse area for biology in terms of marine organisms and some of the organisms that live in the swampy areas. Think about Florida. All right, they keep developing areas in Florida, including the big swamps in Central Florida. The difficulty with that is that those swamps absorb all the rainfall from the hurricanes that they get hit with every year. Without those swamps, that water from the hurricanes is just going to run off and cause all sorts of damage. Now, semi-arid lands, unfortunately, because of over grazing by sheep and goats and cows and things like that, are reverting to desert-like conditions because the animals are simply scouring the landscape and destroying all of the vegetation. And once the vegetation is gone, there's nothing to hold the water, or even to draw the water up from the lower levels of the soil, and that leads to desertification, which is when as land is converted to desert. In the tropics, especially in South America, deforestation leads to all sorts of problems with the land as well. Uh, Once you've cut down all the trees, it becomes difficult to convert that land into farmland. So, all right. Now, in terms of water, 70% of the fresh water that's used worldwide is used for irrigating crops. 70%. That only leaves 30% for all of the other things that we use water for, showers and flushing toilets and stuff like that. All right. So 70% is used to grow our food. All right. In more developed countries, we use more water for taking showers and baths and flushing toilets and watering lawns than we do for drinking and cooking. But in more less developed countries, they use the water for drinking and cooking more frequently. Um, Oftentimes, in order to divert the flow of water, we will build dams. Dams will change the flow of a river, and they lose a lot of water and eventually become filled in by sediment. So either you have to dredge the area behind the dam, or you've got to build the dam even higher. Um, at the same time, we're draining our aquifers. And this can lead to all sorts of problems. If you drain an aquifer completely, that'll lead to huge sinkholes where just huge swaths of land just collapse because the water underneath them was holding them up, and now it's not there, and so the ground sinks. And so that is a serious issue in many areas of the world. Our food comes from several different sources: crops, raising animals, and fishing. Um, and we, unfortunately, in many areas of the world, use harmful farming methods. We plant only a few varieties of crops. In this country, it's wheat and corn are the big ones, although there are certainly others. Um, but we use fertilizers, pesticides, and insecticides. And all of these things change the makeup of the environment around us. We use a lot of fuel and a lot of water in order to make those crops grow. These farming methods lead to soil loss, soil degradation, meaning that the soil becomes less and less um, quality as time goes on. Um, and it can lead to issues. Um, there's a big um, push these days over genetically engineered crops. We talked about genetic modifications. There's some controversy about this. Should we be genetically modifying our food? Right. Well, some people don't think they want to eat that. For some, I don't know. Maybe they think they're going to become mutants. One of the X-Men or something because they ate a tomato of a certain variety. Um, I don't see the issue in that because honestly, all food is food. You digest it, you break it down into its building blocks, and then you put it back together in whatever form your body needs it. However, some people are against using genetically modified crops. All right, I would respond to that by saying all of our crops are genetically modified. We have chosen the plumpest tomatoes and the biggest cows and all the other things that we've done to change our agricultural lifestyle. Um, Raising livestock, cows, sheep, chickens, accounts for a lot of the pollution that's associated with farming because it's very, very energy intensive. You're using a good amount of the crops to feed the animals. Okay. However, you do have to keep in mind that livestock, animals, are a necessary part of our diet. We are omnivores, and we need that protein-rich diet um, to uh, to grow and be healthy. In terms of energy resources, all right, we have again two different types here. The non-renewable resources include the fossil fuels. These again are carbon-based compounds that were once um, living organisms. All right, the oil and natural gas and coal were once the dinosaurs and the swamps the dinosaurs lived in, and that sort of thing. Now, the burning of fossil fuels does emit carbon dioxide and other gases into the environment, um, but um, it also has allowed us to industrialize and live the lifestyles that we are currently used to. Um, Even though the United States makes up 5% of the world's population, we do use more than half of the fossil fuel energy in the world. Um, and as we talked about in the last chapter, the buildup of greenhouse gases may lead to global warming. Um, it's there are lots of factors that go into climate change, and honestly, uh, even the most diehard climate folks no longer use the term global warming. We call it climate change because the Earth is getting warmer in some spots, but not in others. All right. Again, I don't want to make this a political thing, just laying out the facts. Renewable resources include things like hydropower, geothermal energy, wind, and solar energy. Now, um, to listen to certain politicians talk, this is the best thing ever, and there's no problems with it, and it's perfect solution, and all that kind of stuff. Well, in order to get hydropower, you need to build dams, all right, or you need to put I forget what they're called, but long stretches of um, material in the ocean to catch the tides. All right, this obviously changes the ecosystems behind the dams and in the oceans. All right, and so that's not necessarily a damage-free answer. Geothermal energy is using energy directly out of the earth to heat your home or business. And again, this is actually a reasonably good aspect, and it's very efficient if and depending on how deep you have to dig the well in order to do this. Wind energy is touted all the time. You see pictures and images on TV of big windmills and that sort of thing. But the windmills are killing the birds. All right, those propellers are moving pretty quick through the air, and underneath each of those windmills are piles and piles of dead bird bodies. Um, Solar energy is also one of the things that's been talked about in great detail later on. Um, but right now, the energy that's captured by these things is offset by the energy that's required to build the panels. The minerals and other materials that are used to build these things are mined out of the ground, and so the payoff and the panels themselves are not recyclable because of the toxic metals that they have, and they only last 10 to 15 years or so. Now, should we be working on developing all of these things? Absolutely. All right, because we are going to run out of fossil fuels, and these are certainly um, different for the environment. Maybe not better, maybe not worse, but different. And so we should certainly be researching them and trying to figure out ways that we can make this all work. Um, Now, minerals. We have these are non-renewable
It's
raw.
2 o'clock.
Well, thank you, Jesus. Minerals are non-renewable raw materials that are mined from the Earth's crust. They include things like fossil fuels, non-metallic minerals like sand. We use sand to make glass. All right, phosphate, and so on. And then there are also the metals, which include things like copper and iron and tin and aluminum, gold, silver, and so on. Um, Consumption of these minerals does contribute to hazardous wastes. We use them in different fashions that are non-recyclable, like I mentioned in the solar panels in the previous slide. And the mining process, of course, produces a great amount of hazardous waste as well. Production of plastics, pesticides, herbicides produce a lot of wastes as well. Um, There there is a class of compounds called CFCs, which usually come from aerosol cans, although they've been banned in the United States, and they were damaging the ozone layer. All right, this has actually healed itself over the course of the last 20 years or so, and so it's gotten the hole in the ozone is probably something that you guys didn't even learn about in school. Although when I was your age, the hole in the ozone was going to be the end of the world. So, which is that means that we have hope. There's a chance that we can reverse a lot of these things by finding the proper solutions here. Um, and finally, on this list, wastes that enter bodies of water can cause eutrophication, all right, an explosion of plant growth that literally chokes out all of the animal life in a small body of water. So that brings us to the end of the first of two videos on human population and resources. And I hope you learned something.